January 1944. A cold morning settles over a prisoner of war camp in the American Midwest. Barbed wire glints under pale winter light. Wooden barracks stand in rigid rows. Guard towers watch silently. Inside the mess hall, the air carries the unfamiliar smell of milk and sugar. German soldiers step forward in line, their boots still worn from campaigns across Europe and North Africa. Many have not tasted sweetness in years. Rationing at home had reduced desserts to memories. In Germany, butter was scarce, milk was diluted, sugar was measured by the gram. Metal trays slide across a counter. Not soup, not thin bread, but something white, frozen. A scoop settles into a bowl, ice cream. The men hesitate. Some laugh, unsure if this is mockery. Others stare, waiting for the trick to reveal itself. No one speaks. The guards do not react. Spoons are handed out calmly, as if nothing about this moment is unusual. Far across the Atlantic, cities burn. Civilians queue for turnips. Children grow thin under Allied blockade and bombing. Yet here, behind wire and watchtowers, captured soldiers of the Reich are being served a dessert their own families can no longer afford. That quiet contradiction will force a reckoning, one that begins far from this camp in a world already at war. When war erupted in Europe in September 1939, food became a weapon almost immediately. The British naval blockade, reimposed within days of Germany's invasion of Poland, was designed not merely to interrupt military supply lines, but to choke the economic lifeblood of the Reich. It was a strategy refined during the First World War, when starvation had weakened German morale long before defeat arrived on the battlefield. This time, Berlin was determined not to repeat that humiliation. The Nazi state introduced rationing within weeks of the war's start. At first, the system appeared orderly. Bread, meat, fats, sugar, and dairy were carefully measured. Propaganda assured civilians that scientific planning and conquest would guarantee abundance. Victory, they were told, would feed the nation. But by 1940, the cracks were already visible. Imports of grain and animal feed declined sharply under blockade pressure. Livestock numbers fell. Butter and cheese became luxuries reserved for special allocations. By 1941, many German households were receiving less than half the pre-war availability of fats and sugar. Ersatz products, substitutes made from acorns, turnips, or chemical compounds, filled shelves where real food once stood. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 was not driven by ideology alone. It was also a war for calories. The agricultural wealth of Ukraine was meant to sustain Germany and its armies indefinitely. Instead, the campaign consumed vast resources while delivering far less food than promised. Transport shortages, partisan warfare, and scorched earth retreats disrupted supply lines. Hunger followed the Wehrmacht eastward. By 1942, ration cards defined daily life across the Reich. Urban families queued for hours in the cold. Rural households hoarded when they could. Children learned to accept watery soups and bread stretched thin with fillers. Fresh fruit all but disappeared in winter months. Ice cream, once a small but familiar pleasure in pre-war Germany, vanished entirely. It required milk, sugar, and refrigeration. All three were increasingly unattainable. As Allied bombing intensified in 1943, the situation worsened. Rail lines were destroyed. Cold storage facilities were damaged. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and later Berlin saw food distribution collapse under air raids. Even soldiers on home leave noticed the change. Portions were smaller. Meals were fewer. Civilians spoke in hushed voices about hunger. Yet within the ranks of the German military, another belief remained firmly in place. From the earliest days of Nazi training and indoctrination, soldiers were warned about enemy captivity. British camps would starve them. American guards would humiliate them. Prisoners, they were told, would be worked, beaten, and forgotten. This fear was reinforced by Germany's own treatment of captured enemy soldiers, particularly on the Eastern Front. By the time German units began surrendering in large numbers in North Africa in 1942, many did so with dread rather than relief. These men had survived desert warfare, shortages, and defeat. But captivity, according to everything they had been taught, promised something worse: hunger, degradation, slow decay behind wire. They carried these expectations with them as they were marched into Allied hands. Expectations shaped by propaganda, by memory of the last war, and by the reality unfolding at home. None of them imagined that captivity would offer something Germany itself could no longer provide. And none yet knew that surrender would take them far from Europe, across an ocean where war was being fought very differently. The first mass captures of German troops by Western Allied forces occurred far from Europe. In North Africa, during late 1942 and early 1943, the Axis position collapsed under the weight of Allied landings and sustained pressure. When the final surrender came in Tunisia in May 1943, more than 250,000 German and Italian soldiers laid down their arms. It was the largest capitulation of Axis forces to that point in the war. Processing such numbers required a system already prepared for scale. British authorities initially housed prisoners in North Africa and the United Kingdom, but the sheer volume quickly exceeded available capacity. The solution lay across the Atlantic. The United States, untouched by bombing and operating with unmatched industrial output, offered both space and supply. Beginning in 1943, German prisoners were transported by ship to America. The Atlantic, crossing itself, contradicted expectation. Instead of being crammed into holds, prisoners were carried under Geneva Convention standards. Losses to U-boat attacks were rare by this stage of the war, as Allied naval control had tightened. When ships docked, the men stepped onto a continent that appeared calm, ordered, and astonishingly well-fed. By 1944, the United States operated more than 500 POW camps across nearly every state. From Texas to Minnesota, from California to Georgia, barbed wire enclosures rose beside farmland, rail lines, and small towns. Some camps held a few hundred men, others housed several thousand. Most were staffed by older guards or reservists, as frontline troops were needed overseas. The legal framework governing these camps was clear. The United States was a signatory to the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. Under its provisions, captives were to be housed, clothed, and fed at levels comparable to the detaining power's own troops. Retaliation for enemy behavior was explicitly forbidden. Compliance was not optional, it was policy. This policy intersected with a reality few German prisoners could have imagined. American food production during World War II was immense. The continental United States remained agriculturally intact, its farms mechanized and fueled by oil, not horses. Rationing existed, but it was designed to support exports to allies rather than to prevent domestic starvation. Milk production remained high. Sugar, while controlled, was available. Cold storage and refrigeration functioned uninterrupted. U.S. Army regulations required that POWs receive the same basic rations as American soldiers stationed stateside. That meant bread made with real flour, meat served regularly, vegetables grown locally, dairy issued daily in many camps. When surplus existed, It was distributed rather than wasted. The effect was immediate and disorienting. Men who had eaten thin soups and black bread at the front now received balanced meals on a schedule. For many, weight loss stopped within weeks. Some gained weight. Medical reports from camp doctors noted improvements in health, particularly among prisoners captured late in the war. Ice cream entered this environment not as a gesture of kindness, but as a byproduct of abundance. In warmer months, American military kitchens used it to boost morale among troops. POW camps followed similar routines when supplies allowed. Frozen desserts were issued occasionally, often during holidays or after particularly heavy labor details. For German prisoners, this small detail carried immense psychological weight. Ice cream required excess milk, excess sugar, excess refrigeration capacity. It symbolized a system so far removed from scarcity that even captives could be included. As letters began arriving from home, the contrast sharpened. Families wrote of hunger, of destroyed kitchens, of children growing thin, of foods remembered rather than tasted. These letters passed through camp censors, but the message remained unmistakable. Behind American wire, German soldiers were eating better than their own people, and slowly, inevitably, that realization began to fracture something deeper than hunger. Human angle. For the German prisoner, the shock was not immediate violence, but its absence. The routine of the camps settled quickly into predictability. Morning roll call, work details, meals served on schedule. It was at those meals that disbelief lingered longest. Many prisoners approached the mess hall cautiously in the early weeks, convinced that generosity was temporary. Hunger had taught them suspicion. Yet days passed, then weeks, and the food did not diminish. Bread remained fresh. Milk was served regularly. In some camps, butter appeared without ration tokens. When ice cream was issued, the reaction was deeply personal. Some men ate it slowly, afraid it would disappear if rushed. Others pushed it aside, overwhelmed by a mixture of guilt and confusion. Letters from home described mothers skipping meals so children could eat, fathers trading possessions for potatoes. The knowledge that one was consuming sugar and dairy in captivity, while family endured scarcity, created a quiet, lasting tension. Conversations in barracks shifted. Ideological debates softened. Survival instincts recalibrated. The camp became a place not of physical suffering, but of mental reckoning. Men who had marched across Europe under banners and slogans now found themselves confronting a reality that propaganda had never prepared them for. Moral angle. The treatment of German prisoners by the United States was not accidental nor purely sentimental. It was rooted in doctrine. American military leadership viewed adherence to the Geneva Convention as both a legal obligation and a strategic necessity. Humane treatment reinforced moral authority at a time when the Axis powers were increasingly associated with atrocity. This approach was tested repeatedly. News of German actions against Allied prisoners, especially in the East, reached Washington. There were voices calling for reciprocity. They were overruled. U.S. policy remained consistent. Prisoners would be fed, housed, and treated according to international law, regardless of enemy conduct. The result was a system that operated with bureaucratic calm. Camp commanders did not decide rations. Regulations did. Guards were instructed to maintain discipline without humiliation. Religious services were permitted. Recreational activities were organized. Food, above all, became a daily demonstration of compliance. Ice cream in this context was not kindness. It was normalcy. It was what American soldiers received, and by regulation, prisoners received the same. That parody carried moral weight. It sent an unspoken message. Captivity did not require cruelty. Psychological warfare angle. Without intending it, the United States achieved a form of psychological impact more effective than interrogation. The gap between expectation and reality undermined the ideological framework many German soldiers had internalized. Nazi propaganda had portrayed the United States as decadent, brutal, and racially fractured. American camps contradicted that narrative daily. Prisoners worked alongside guards who spoke casually, ate the same meals, and enforced rules without rage. Black and white American soldiers appeared in roles that propaganda insisted were impossible. Food became the most persuasive argument of all. No speech could compete with a full stomach. No leaflet could match the experience of eating ice cream under enemy custody while one's homeland starved. The ideological certainty that had sustained many soldiers through defeat began to erode quietly, without confrontation. By late 1944, U.S. intelligence reports noted declining resistance among German POWs. Cooperation increased. Discipline problems declined. Some prisoners openly criticized the regime they had served. The camps had become spaces not of coercion, but of comparison. And that comparison, once made, could not be undone. Logistical and industrial angle. What made the experience of German prisoners so jarring was not merely American policy, but American capacity. The United States entered the war with an agricultural system unmatched in scale, mechanized farming, synthetic fertilizers, and a vast rail network allowed food to move efficiently from field to table. While Europe struggled under blockade and bombardment, American production surged. By 1943, U.S. farms were producing more dairy than at any point in history. Milk plants operated around the clock. Cold storage facilities, insulated from attack, preserved butter, meat, and frozen goods in quantities Europe could not imagine. Rationing existed, but it was a matter of distribution, not survival. POW camps were folded into this system seamlessly. Kitchens received standardized supplies. Menus were planned weeks in advance. When surplus occurred, regulations encouraged its use rather than disposal. Frozen desserts were practical, not extravagant. Ice cream was calorie-dense, morale-boosting, and already integrated into military supply chains. For German prisoners, this logistical reality reframed the war itself. Defeat no longer seemed only a matter of battlefield tactics. It was a contest between systems, one collapsing under strain, the other expanding under pressure. Leadership angle. American leadership understood the long horizon of the war. Officers overseeing POW operations were trained to think beyond immediate containment. They saw prisoners not only as captives, but as future civilians who would eventually return home. This perspective shaped daily decisions. Camps enforced discipline firmly, but avoided needless severity. Prisoners were allowed to work for pay, earning small wages credited to accounts usable at camp canteens. Some purchased extra food, others saved for release. Commanders documented camp conditions meticulously. Inspectors from the Red Cross visited regularly. Reports emphasized compliance, order, and sanitation. Food quality was consistently noted as adequate or better. These decisions were not universally popular. Local American civilians sometimes questioned why enemy soldiers appeared well-fed while rationing restricted certain goods at home. Military leadership responded with clarity. Treatment of prisoners reflected national values, not enemy behavior. Ice cream served to prisoners became a symbol of this philosophy, not indulgence, but confidence. Confidence that the war would be won without abandoning standards. Enemy. Perspective. Angle. Letters from Germany transformed the camps into places of revelation. Though censored, correspondence conveyed desperation. Food shortages worsened through 1944. Allied bombing destroyed bakeries and rail depots. In some cities, daily caloric intake fell to subsistence levels. Prisoners read these letters aloud in barracks. The contrast was impossible to ignore. They compared ration lists. They counted meals. They noted how often milk appeared on their trays. Some reacted with bitterness, others with shame, a few with gratitude so intense it unsettled them. Captivity had become a refuge from hunger. The ideological foundations of loyalty cracked. Men began discussing what Germany had promised and what it had delivered. The ice cream, trivial as it seemed, became evidence, proof that the enemy's system worked while their own had failed. By the time winter approached again in Europe, many German prisoners no longer believed the war could be won. They sensed a turning point not in battle reports, but in the quiet, everyday realities of camp life. And as those realizations accumulated, the war itself moved toward a decisive close.
By the summer of 1944, the contradiction at the heart of the German prisoner experience had fully formed. The war in Europe was accelerating toward catastrophe, while life behind American wire remained steady, predictable, and well-fed. News reached the camps slowly, but relentlessly. The Allied landings in Normandy in June were confirmed through official announcements and fragments of radio broadcasts. Prisoners knew what it meant. The Western Front was open. Germany was now fighting on two collapsing fronts that as the months passed. Reports from home darkened. Cities were reduced to rubble. Transportation networks failed. Food shortages deepened into hunger. Civilians survived on thin soups and rationed bread made with fillers that barely resembled grain. Inside American camps, the seasons turned without disruption. Harvests came in. Dairy production remained high. Kitchens adjusted menus, but quantity did not decline. POW labor details, often agricultural, brought prisoners into direct contact with the abundance surrounding them. They picked crops they knew their families would never see. Ice cream appeared again during the warmer months. Issued without ceremony, it landed on trays as casually as bread. No speeches accompanied it. No attempt was made to impress. That indifference made it more powerful. For many prisoners, this was the moment something broke. The realization that the enemy could afford generosity, even indifference, while Germany demanded sacrifice it could no longer sustain. Hunger, they now understood, was not universal. It was political. Medical officers noted changes. Prisoners stabilized physically even as morale shifted inward. The energy once directed toward resistance drained away. Discussions turned philosophical. What had the war been for? What had been promised? What had been lost? The camps became places of quiet reckoning. Nazi hardliners attempted to maintain discipline, but their authority eroded. Men who had endured years of indoctrination found it impossible to reconcile the comforts of captivity with the suffering described in letters from home. By late 1944, American intelligence observed a measurable change. Prisoners volunteered information more freely. Ideological compliance waned. Some openly rejected the regime they had served. The environment, orderly, fed, regulated, had done what interrogation could not do as winter approached Europe again. Germany faced starvation on a scale unseen since the previous war. The contrast sharpened daily. Each spoonful of ice cream carried weight, far beyond its calories. And then, in the camps, the prisoners began to receive news not just of hardship, but of collapse that by early 1945, German prisoners of war in the United States faced a reality that was almost impossible to reconcile. Reports trickled in. Berlin's food distribution system was failing entirely. Allied bombing had destroyed key infrastructure, rail lines, factories, and storage facilities. Civilians were queuing for hours in freezing weather, often leaving with only turnips or thin broth. Children grew thin, their health deteriorating under relentless shortages. Letters from home, censored but unmistakable, described bread rationed to a few hundred grams a day, butter non-existent, and sugar a memory. The prisoners held these letters in their hands, comparing them silently to the meals they received in camp. Breakfast was complete, with eggs, milk, and cereal. Lunch brought meat and fresh vegetables. Dinner included dessert, sometimes fruit, sometimes chocolate, occasionally, even ice cream. For men who had marched across deserts and bombed landscapes, this abundance was surreal. One former soldier recalled later. We had been told that Americans were cruel, that they starved their captives, that we would suffer. And then we ate ice cream, and it was normal, delicious, and we couldn't understand why. That dissonance, repeated day after day, created a slow but undeniable erosion of belief. April 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Berlin and Hitler's regime crumbled, the reality could no longer be denied. Newspapers filtered into camps. Radio broadcasts confirmed the liberation of cities. Reports of civilians starving and armies surrendering painted a bleak picture of the Reich. Meanwhile, American camps continued their routines. The prisoners, once trained to endure hunger, now faced another lesson. Survival was possible even in enemy hands. This realization sparked deep psychological shifts. The men understood that the promises of their leaders, glorified sacrifice, heroic struggle, ultimate victory, were illusions in the face of practical, systemic failure. Ice cream on a summer day became a symbol of that contradiction. It represented more than sugar. It was evidence that order, efficiency, and humanity could exist in the midst of war. It was, paradoxically, both indulgence and instruction. Some prisoners attempted to rationalize the contradiction. They argued that perhaps the camps were exceptional, that the war had not yet reached its climax, that these comforts were temporary. But the correspondence from home, detailing starvation, collapse, and destruction, made denial impossible. The American approach to logistics, to adherence to international law, and to humane treatment achieved an outcome no battle could replicate. It unmade ideological certainty. Where German propaganda had promised suffering for those captured, prisoners experienced structured, generous care. Where the Reich could not provide even basic sustenance, the enemy delivered abundance. The climactic understanding was not sudden but cumulative. Each meal, each scoop of ice cream, each clean blanket, each completed work detail without punishment, reinforced the gap between expectation and reality. Prisoners began questioning their previous loyalties, their assumptions, and the very ideology they had defended. To be why May 1945, when Germany finally surrendered unconditionally, the psychological turning point was complete. Soldiers who had feared humiliation now faced a paradox. They were free to return to a homeland ravaged by famine, ruin, and despair, while the memories of civility, nourishment, and relative comfort remained vivid. Ice cream, so trivial in itself, had become a lasting marker of this historical rupture, a small, sweet anchor to a larger truth about survival, morality, and the uneven realities of war. The camps did not close immediately. Repatriation took months, yet the lessons lingered. Former POWs would carry with them the cognitive dissonance of abundance amid destruction, a story that underscored not the cruelty of their captors, but the failure of their own nation to sustain its people. And as the prisoners were eventually loaded onto ships bound for Europe, they carried more than personal belongings. They carried knowledge that warfare is not only measured in bullets, bombs, or territory, but also in the management of resources, the exercise of humanity, and the profound consequences of logistical and moral choices. The ice cream they had eaten in the Midwest became emblematic of that lesson, a quiet, immutable witness to the collapse of expectation and the endurance of principle. This awareness would shape not only their personal understanding of the war, but also the broader historical memory of how the Axis powers' defeat was not determined solely by military might, but by the cumulative failures of infrastructure, ideology, and humanity itself. The guns fell silent in May 1945, and with the surrender of Germany, the Second World War in Europe officially ended. Yet for the German prisoners held in the United States, the war did not end with gunfire. It ended with an awareness, a stark confrontation between expectation and reality. For years, these men had been told that captivity meant suffering, Now, they were leaving behind a system that had preserved their lives and health, even offering pleasures like ice cream, luxuries unimaginable back home. Repatriation began slowly. Transport ships were crowded but organized. Men who had spent months or years in camps across the Midwest boarded vessels, bound for a homeland devastated by war. Cities were rubble. Infrastructure had collapsed. Food was scarce. Families had been displaced. Homes destroyed. Hunger remained the dominant force in daily life. In contrast, the prisoners remembered mess halls stocked with bread, meat, milk, and desserts. The psychological dissonance was profound. Many German soldiers returned home physically healthier than they had been before capture. POW records documented weight gain, improved immunity, and recovery from malnutrition-related ailments. Yet emotionally and mentally, the return was jarring. Men who had endured the ideological rigor of Nazi indoctrination were confronted with the failure of the very system they had defended. Hunger, rationing, and the collapse of civilian morale contrasted starkly with the abundance of their time in American camps. Letters, diaries, and post-war interviews reveal a pattern. Some men experienced guilt at having eaten while their families had starved, guilt at having survived relatively unscathed while their homeland suffered. Others struggled with shame, recognizing that the regime they had served was incapable of sustaining its people, even as they had endured captivity with dignity. This introspection became a central theme in the personal narratives of returning soldiers. The contrast also affected morale and political perception. Returning POWs often spoke candidly about their experiences, noting the discipline, organization, and humanity of their captors. Communities across Germany heard first-hand accounts of American generosity and logistical superiority. These stories contributed to a subtle shift in post-war understanding. The enemy could be humane and competent, while Germany itself had failed in its most basic obligations to its people. At the macro level, historians note that the treatment of POWs in the United States had broader implications. By adhering strictly to Geneva Convention standards and maintaining ample supplies, the U.S. demonstrated that victory could coexist with moral and legal accountability. The camps were not only places of containment, they became instruments of soft power, influencing perceptions of the United States long before the Cold War began. Returning soldiers were, in effect, witnesses to the consequences of systemic collapse. The physical and logistical superiority of the United States contrasted with the scarcity and bureaucratic failure of Germany. Ice cream, milk, and well-balanced meals became symbols of what was possible under a system committed to both efficiency and humanity. They were a reminder that leadership, planning, and moral discipline could achieve outcomes far beyond brute force. In the weeks and months following repatriation, the narratives of former POWs began to circulate more widely. Newspapers, memoirs, and interviews highlighted the strange juxtaposition. Men who had survived the brutality of the front lines were now recounting experiences of kindness and abundance in enemy hands. This humanized the story of war, shifting attention from battles alone to the daily lived experiences of soldiers and civilians alike. As the men settled back into post-war Germany, many carried an internal reckoning. They had witnessed both the devastation of their own nation and the unexpected generosity of its adversaries. They had eaten ice cream while Germany starved. They had slept in warm, well-stocked barracks while their families faced ruin. And these memories, often recounted quietly in homes and communities, became enduring reminders that warfare was as much about logistics, policy, and morality as it was about combat. This reflection, subtle yet profound, would prepare the ground for understanding the broader consequences of the war, not only in terms of geopolitics and reconstruction, but also in the human psyche. The prisoners' experiences in America left them uniquely positioned to contrast the failures of the Reich with the capabilities of the Allied powers. The stage was set for the second phase of the aftermath, the long-term historical and societal impact of these contradictions. The repatriation of German prisoners stretched into late 1945, with many men arriving home months after the official surrender. Europe lay in ruins, and Germany, divided by occupation zones, faced a humanitarian crisis. Infrastructure was destroyed, railways impassable, and food supplies critically low. Civilians relied on Allied aid just to survive. Former POWs returned to this desolation, carrying not only their belongings, but also memories of a world that had seemed entirely unreal. Life behind barbed wire that was safer, cleaner, and more nourishing than the streets of their own cities. Historians note that these experiences shaped post-war German society in subtle but lasting ways. Letters, diaries, and oral histories reveal how former prisoners recounted their treatment in America, often in stark contrast to the conditions their families endured. Ice cream, chocolate, and fresh milk became recurring symbols in these narratives, markers of abundance, order, and a morality that their homeland could no longer provide. Such stories influence perceptions of the United States and its people, softening hostility and fostering a grudging respect that would carry into the post-war era. On a societal level, these experiences challenged entrenched ideas of loyalty and obedience. Many returning soldiers confronted the failure of Nazi leadership, not merely on the battlefield, but in the failure to sustain a nation. Starving families, destroyed infrastructure, and the collapse of essential services highlighted systemic incompetence. In contrast, the U.S. demonstrated that efficiency, planning, and adherence to humanitarian standards could prevail even amidst global conflict. For some former POWs, this comparison became a lens through which they would understand the causes and consequences of Germany's defeat. The moral clarity of the American approach to prisoners also set a precedent for post-war international norms. By following the Geneva Convention strictly, the United States reinforced the idea that humane treatment of captives is not a weakness, but a strategic and ethical advantage. Military planners and policymakers would later cite the POW program as evidence that wartime ethics and operational success can coexist. The contrast with Germany's treatment of Allied POWs in the East further emphasized the impact of policy decisions on both immediate and long-term outcomes. Psychologically, the experience of abundance during captivity left enduring impressions. Some former prisoners described a sense of disbelief and, at times, guilt. They had been fed well while their families went hungry. Yet others recalled how the humane treatment reshaped their understanding of authority, trust, and human decency. Many reported that these lessons influenced their post-war choices, from career paths to political attitudes, and even interactions with former enemies. Academically, the treatment of German POWs in the United States has become a reference point for studies in logistics, psychology, and international law. Scholars have emphasized how effective organization and supply, coupled with adherence to ethical standards, can produce outcomes more powerful than coercion or punishment. The distribution of food, the provision of adequate shelter, and even the seemingly trivial issuance of ice cream are analyzed not as minor details, but as integral factors in the broader war narrative, factors that influence morale, ideology, and post-war reconciliation. Ultimately, the aftermath of this paradox, well-fed prisoners returning to a starving homeland, offers a unique lens through which to examine the human and systemic dimensions of warfare. It reveals how logistics, policy, and morality intersect to produce consequences that extend far beyond the battlefield. The ice cream that once elicited laughter, disbelief, or guilt becomes emblematic, a symbol of the unexpected ways in which war can reshape lives, beliefs, and history itself. As the POWs disembarked from ships and trains, stepping onto streets that were both familiar and alien, they carried with them an enduring lesson. War is not only fought with guns and bombs, but also with planning, discipline, and occasionally compassion. And in that lesson lies the bridge to reflection, the quiet understanding of what this episode meant for history, humanity, and the moral dimensions of conflict. History often remembers war in terms of battles won, cities taken, and armies defeated. But sometimes, the most profound moments are quiet. The German prisoners of war in the United States did not face starvation, did not endure daily brutality, and yet they experienced a lesson far deeper than any battlefield could teach. They tasted abundance when their own nation was collapsing, and in that simple act, scooping ice cream into a bowl, they confronted the limits of ideology, the fragility of propaganda, and the unexpected power of humane governance. Ice cream, milk, and warm meals were trivial in isolation, yet monumental in context. They symbolized the intersection of logistics, ethics, and human decency. They demonstrated that a society could choose efficiency and morality simultaneously, sustaining life even amidst the chaos of global conflict. For the men who ate it, each bite was a quiet rebuke of the system they had served. It was a reminder that victory belongs not only to those who wield weapons, but also to those who master planning, organization, and compassion. This episode also reveals the human dimension of war. Soldiers and civilians alike endure suffering, yet the contrast between scarcity and abundance has the power to reshape belief, loyalty, and perspective. The German POWs returned to a homeland starving and broken, carrying with them the memory of care, order, and nourishment. That memory endured, influencing personal choices, post-war attitudes, and even broader cultural perceptions of the United States. Ultimately, the story is not about ice cream itself, but about what it represents: the capacity of humanity to persist, to organize, and to maintain decency even in times of unimaginable violence. It reminds us that war is not only fought in the sky, on land, or at sea. It is also fought in kitchens, warehouses, and mess halls. And sometimes, victory is measured not in conquest, but in the quiet triumph of feeding those who once feared they would starve. In the end, the POWs' disbelief, laughter, and gratitude serve as a lasting testament. Even amid destruction and despair, human systems, when guided by foresight and principle, can preserve life, dignity, and occasionally, something as sweet as ice cream.